let me briefly, and I'll leave this more to others, but let you at least think about what 100 million more folks might mean. Just nice round number again. It has to mean, or it should mean, assuming the same ratio of vehicles to people that we have today, about 79 million more motor vehicles on the road than would otherwise be the case. And of course, you've got to build the roads and so forth to accommodate the 79 million. Yeah, don't know, but it's quite a lot. If it depends on how you think about this. Presumably a lot of it is road widening and increasing, access. But whatever or you could think of it as 1/3 more than we have now. So if we have 1 billion miles of roads, you would take 1/3 of that because yeah, it's about 3 times 79 because 100 million, assuming that same sort of ratio. So it's somewhat less than 300 million on the road right now. So, or vehicles. This is vehicles, by the way. So you have to have trucks and so forth to deliver food. It's not just passenger vehicles. Again, you'd need about 39 million new housing units that have to be constructed. The land has to be cleared. And if you grow the population or have 100 million more people, assuming the same average size household that we have today, which is very roughly like 2.5 people, 2.6 people per household, you're going to need something like 39 million new households. Plus, you're going to need places for them to shop and work. Another way of thinking about it, including the land and so forth that you would need and the vehicles, is you have to estimate about 2 billion extra tons of CO2 emissions, or about 1/3 of what we're putting out. Right now, as Phil pointed out, it's about 6 billion. He did it in thousands, but if you just do it in billions, it's about 6 billion. Now, this assumes that the new 100 million will consume, and of course, we don't make any progress in reducing our CO2 emissions, but it does give you an idea. Now, this is an interesting point because some people might say, okay, it is going to add 100 million to the U.S., but, those people would exist anyway. I'll talk about that in just a second, but the point is, whether they're here or there, maybe it doesn't make so much difference. Well, as we know that if they're here, it does make an enormous difference in terms of their environmental impact. Certainly on us, it makes a huge difference, and on our environment, which we're supposed to be custodians of. But forget about the United States. Let's just think globally here. People, by coming to the United States, you take the average immigrant and you look at their average income, roughly speaking, if you look at what they would produce in their home country, even trying to control for their education levels and so forth, people who come to the United States increase their greenhouse gas emissions 4- or 5-fold. Number one sending country is Mexico, as many of you probably know, and they account for maybe 1/3 of all the foreign-born, legal and illegal, or all the immigrants in the United States, legal and illegal. And the average person in Mexico puts out about 4 tons a year. The average person in the United States, about 20 tons a year. Now, it is true that the average Mexican in the United States is a lot poorer, and you can take that into account, but it still looks like he increases his greenhouse gas emissions by coming to the United States by roughly 2.5 times at least. So quite a big. For someone from China or India, especially India, it's much more. Someone from the less developed parts of the Caribbean or Central America, it's also much more on average. 4 or 5 times is the net increase. So moving people to the United States has enormous global implications for something like CO2 emissions. There is another way in which immigration, it's a more modest effect, but it's worth thinking about, and that is that immigrants do have larger families here than they do back in their home countries. We can look at several different data sources, but they have about 23% larger families coming here, looking at the top 10 countries anyway. So if you compare what fertility of people in Mexico is versus people in the United States, you get a much higher figure for the United States, which is not that easy to explain. Because the average woman in Mexico may have only about 2.2 or 2.4 children. In the United States, she has 3.2 or 3.4 children. It's an interesting question as to why that is, but the bottom line is you get, as a result of people coming to the United States, a significant increase in the overall number of births in the world. So if you're only concerned with world population, it does seem that migration to the United States increases the number of births in the world. Now, relative to the number of births in the world, the impact isn't enormous. It's interesting, when we try to control for education, it makes the situation even more pronounced. In other words, more educated women the world over, here and in developing countries, have fewer children. If you compare the education level of immigrants in the United States and try to project, based on where they're from, what their fertility would have been in their home countries, you actually get an even wider gap with what it actually is. So although on average, if we looked at that, we get that 23% increase. If you control for education, you get a 33% higher fertility. So again, even when we try to control for what we can, it does look like immigration, the movement of people to the United States, significantly increases their fertility. In some cases, quite a lot. In other cases, less so. But that's important if you're someone concerned about only world population growth. Then immigration clearly is problematic in that way because it significantly increases the total number of births in the United States. What's that? Yeah, for the births is a study called Births Among Immigrants in the United States, and it's based on an analysis of the American Community Survey. And I'm the lead author. That's on my website. On the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey asks individuals if they're immigrants, and it also, nicely enough, asks if they've had a child in the last year. So you can calculate what's called a total fertility rate, a TFR. It also asks things like their educational attainment. And we do have some pretty good statistics for birth rates or TFRs, total fertility rates, of women in developing countries by education. So we can make an interesting comparison. It's not true in every single case in every single country. It doesn't seem to be true for the Philippines, for example. But for most of the primary sending countries, it seems that people have more children once they come here. Well, it's certainly correct to point out that the average housing square footage of a U.S. house has been going up, and up, and so has per capita, or at least for a long time, energy consumption to maintain the larger household. So that's a house, not household. Household size actually has been falling. If those trends were continued, then you're going to even need more household units. Because if you have fewer people per household and you still have 100 million more people, then you need more units. So that could be the case. But here in that those brief numbers, we're just assuming the current ratio. Maybe we'll make a huge investment in mass transit. It won't be 79 million more vehicles. Maybe it'll only be 49 million more vehicles. And maybe we'll make other investments. So it's possible to be more than these numbers and not. But this just assumes the current ratio of houses to people and vehicles to people. And that ratio is actually held pretty constant. So we'll have to see if that changes. Maybe policy would change it. Let me just go to my conclusion here. And what does all this say? Well, I mean, the bottom line is if you have large-scale immigration, it has to equal large-scale population growth. Roy mentioned something that's interesting. In the past, say around 1900 or even 1950, Americans generally had relatively large families. So even if you had large-scale immigration, which we had in 1900, not 1950, it doesn't necessarily account for the overwhelming fraction of population growth because the native-born population having lots of kids. In the United States, somewhat unusual, I should point out, for an industrialized democracy, the average native-born woman still has about 2 children. But as you might guess, if each woman on average, and this is just basic demographics, has 2 children or actually slightly more than 2 children, your population over time, assuming no immigration, would do what? It'd roughly stabilize. So without immigration, given the current fertility of American women, our population would slowly stabilize. But not for a while. As I've tried to show you, there's still population growth even without any immigration, and that population growth continues for many, many years. Another important point. You might say, well, I still want to have a lot of immigration, and what I'll do is I'll try to reduce U.S. fertility quite a lot. But that's right. You'd have to reduce it quite a lot if you wanted to stabilize the U.S. population. Because remember, there are only about 3.2 million births to U.S.-born women each year. And so if you have 1.5 million or 1.3 million immigrants, you'd have to reduce the number of births by something like that number. Well, that's like cutting fertility by a third. And then you have to take into account the children that the immigrants have. Now, presumably you'd want the immigrants to bring their fertility rates down as well, but that's still a couple 100,000 births. So unless you imagine that you can get American women to have maybe 25 to 50% fewer children, which they don't seem to want to do, there's no way to have mass immigration and not have a lot of population growth. And that's not just because the immigrants have more children on average, but it's just simply adding more people through immigration. So if you're hopeful, you can still argue that we have too many children on average. You could argue we have too few, I suppose. But it's very hard to imagine the kinds of massive declines in American fertility that would be necessary to sort of stabilize the population in the face of this much immigration. I guess my final point would just be what I think others have said, is that if, and this is an if, and I'll leave it to others to answer this question, if population size matters to the environment, then you have to look at immigration. Now, if you think it doesn't matter, you say, look, it doesn't matter if the United States goes to 4 or 5 or 600 million people over the next century, then it doesn't matter, and that's one perspective. But if you think population size matters, you have to look at immigration, because that's the key determinant. That's really the story of U.S. population growth, as of course it kind of has to be if, on average, Americans have 2 children, which is roughly what it takes, each couple having 2 children, to replace the population. And with that, I'll conclude.